Margaret Holloway posted a demolition notice on Linda's studio at 7:00 in the morning, and she did it while I was standing right there at the kitchen window watching her. She knew I could see her. She did it anyway. That was her first real mistake. Not the notice itself, but the confidence behind it. The kind of confidence that only comes from 5 years of watching people fold. She taped that paper to the studio door with the slow, deliberate calm of someone who has already written the ending. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment. Not dreading it, waiting for it. I didn't go outside. I didn't knock on the window. I picked up the spiral notebook from the kitchen drawer and wrote down the time, 7:09 a.m. Then I wrote, notice posted without county authorization. Witnessed firsthand. Date confirmed. She walked back to her white Range Rover, never once looked at the house, and drove away. I watched her tail lights disappear at the end of Cedarwood Drive and felt something that wasn't anger. It was closer to recognition. The kind a civil engineer feels when he's been studying a structure long enough to know exactly which load will finally bring it down, and he just watched someone apply it. I could have stopped her before she reached the door. I chose not to. When a person mistakes your stillness for weakness and walks further into the open because of it, is that their power or yours? I am not a man who looks for fights. 34 years as a civil engineer in the state of Texas will teach you something that has nothing to do with concrete or drainage or load-bearing calculations. It teaches you that most problems don't announce themselves. They develop quietly in the places nobody thinks to look. A hairline fracture in a retaining wall. A gradual shift in soil composition beneath the foundation. A drainage pattern that seems fine until the third consecutive wet season. By the time the problem becomes visible to everyone else, a trained eye has usually been watching it for months. I moved to Cedarwood Commons 2 years after Linda passed. She died on a Thursday in April, a stroke that came without warning signs we recognized in time. 51 years old. We had been married 26 years, and in those 26 years, she had filled every room she entered with a specific kind of energy that made other people feel steadier just by being near her. She taught ceramics at the Community Arts Center for 3 decades. She believed, genuinely and without irony, that the act of shaping raw clay into something useful was a metaphor worth living by. Patience and the right pressure applied at the right moment. After she was gone, the house we'd shared in Austin felt less like a home and more like a set of rooms I was moving through without purpose. Cedarwood Commons was 72 homes on Oakline streets, a community pool, a neighborhood quiet enough to hear your own thinking. I bought the corner lot specifically for the detached garage, enough space to convert into a studio. I pulled a city permit, submitted the architectural plans to the HOA for written approval, and waited for the inspector to sign off before I moved a single piece of Linda's equipment inside her wheel. Her glazing tools, the shelves of unfinished bowls she never got to complete. I kept everything exactly as she had left it because I wasn't ready to change it, and because there was something right about finishing the work in the space I built for exactly that purpose. The inspector called it textbook compliance. I have that on record. I am not a man who cuts corners on process, not professionally and not personally. 34 years of public infrastructure work will train that tendency out of you if you had it to begin with. Every permit filed, every signature obtained, every step documented before the next one begins. I mention this because it matters to what came next. When Margaret Holloway decided the studio was an eyesore, she was not dealing with a man who had left himself exposed. She was dealing with a man who had spent a career learning that the difference between a structure that stands and one that fails almost always comes down to what was done correctly before anyone was watching. I had done everything correctly, and I had every page to prove it. The first time Margaret and I spoke, she was standing at the mailboxes on Cedarwood Drive with a practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. Before walking over, "Ray, that little studio is really affecting our streetscape." She smiled the way people smile when they've already made the decision and are simply informing you of it. The architectural committee may need to revisit certain approvals. I showed her the permit. I showed her the email, her own words, her own signature block, written approval dated 4 months prior. She looked at both documents the way a person looks at something they have no intention of letting change their position. Standards evolve. Ray, that was it. That was the whole conversation. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for a while, not because I was rattled, because I was thinking. There is a specific kind of person who says, standards evolve, in response to documentation they personally signed. It doesn't mean they've found a legal argument. It means they've decided the outcome first, and will locate the justification afterward. In 34 years of public works, I had dealt with that type exactly twice. Both times, the instinct to respond quickly, to correct the record, to present the evidence, to win the room right now, had cost me. Not because I was wrong, because I was early. Here is what I had learned from those two situations, and from 3 decades of watching structures succeed or fail based on decisions made before the pressure came. You do not defend against someone like Margaret by correcting her in the moment. You defend by making sure that when the moment finally arrives, the real moment, the one with witnesses and documentation, and no room to reframe, there is nothing left to argue about. Every piece of evidence in order, every procedural step completed, every escalation by the opposing party documented and time-stamped and attached. You do not fight the first move. You wait for the move that cannot be walked back. This is not passivity. It is a different kind of discipline, the kind that requires you to absorb early pressure without flinching, because you understand that flinching early is what causes people to show their hand before the board is set. Linda used to say something similar about clay. You can't rush the centering. If you apply force before the clay is ready, you don't speed up the process, you just make the eventual collapse more expensive. I thought about that sitting in the kitchen after the mailbox conversation. Margaret had just told me, clearly and without realizing it, exactly what kind of opponent she intended to be. She had also, without realizing it, told me exactly how much time I had before she committed to something she couldn't undo. I decided I would let her use that time. I would use mine differently. What does it cost a person to stay quiet when they already know how the story ends? Here is what was actually at stake. Not the studio as a building, the studio as the last place on Earth that still held the shape of Linda's life. Her wheel sat exactly where she had positioned it, angled slightly toward the east-facing window, because she preferred morning light when she worked. Her glazing tools hung on the pegboard in the order she had arranged them, smallest to largest, left to right, the way she had organized every workspace she'd ever had. 3 shelves of unfinished bowls lined the back wall. Some were leather-hard, frozen mid-process. Some were bone-dry, waiting for a first firing that never came. She had labeled several of them in her handwriting on small pieces of masking tape pressed to the shelf edge. For the Garza kids, finish with iron oxide wash. Don't rush the drying. I had not changed a single thing. I told myself it was because the space was permitted and approved, and legally mine to keep. That was true, but the fuller truth was that I was not ready to dismantle the last room that still felt like she had just stepped out of it. If Margaret's campaign succeeded, if the complaints kept coming, if the fines accumulated, if the legal pressure became expensive enough that it made more sense to simply demolish the structure and be done with it, I would lose that room. Not the permit. Not the square footage, that room. Those shelves, that wheel positioned toward the morning light. That was the real cost, sitting underneath everything else. I want to be honest about that because it matters for understanding what followed. I was not a man operating purely on legal strategy and cold calculation. I was a widower who had built a room to hold his wife's unfinished work, and someone had decided that room was inconvenient. The anger was there. I won't pretend otherwise, but I had learned from engineering from Linda, from 2 previous situations where I had moved too fast. That anger deployed at the wrong moment doesn't protect what you love. It just makes noise, while the thing you're trying to protect becomes negotiating collateral. I needed to protect the room. That meant I could not afford to be loud, yet the stakes were clear. The timeline was not yet in my favor, and Margaret was only just beginning. The zoning complaint arrived 11 days after the mailbox conversation, filed through the county portal, anonymous on its face, but the language was precise, in a way that suggested someone who knew exactly which boxes to check. It cited the studio's proximity to the property line, within compliance by 4FT, as the approved plans clearly showed, and requested a formal review of the original permit issuance. I pulled the complaint, read it twice, and set it next to the demolition notice in the folder I had started keeping on the kitchen counter. 3 days later, a fire marshal report. A building with no gas lines, no open flame equipment, no accelerants of any kind, flagged for a fire safety inspection. The inspector came on a Wednesday morning, spent 20 minutes inside, and told me on his way out that he wasn't sure why the complaint had been filed. The studio was, in his words, cleaner than most garages he'd seen. He signed off before noon. I documented the visit. I noted his name, his badge number, the time he arrived, and the time he left. A week after that, a noise violation. Equipment that hadn't been operated in 3 weeks. I had not run Linda's wheel since the complaints began. Not because I was intimidated, but because I had no reason to give anyone an additional data point to work with. The noise complaint was dismissed within 48 hours. I filed the dismissal notice in the folder. 3 complaints, 3 dismissals, 11 days apart, then 7, then 5. I had seen this pattern before. Not in neighborhoods, but in procurement disputes and contract challenges during my working years. When someone files sequentially like that, each complaint slightly more targeted than the last, they are not actually trying to win each individual filing. They are trying to map your response threshold. They want to know how much it takes before you call a lawyer, before you go to the board, before you make enough noise that the situation becomes more complicated for everyone. They're looking for the point at which you decide it isn't worth it anymore. My neighbor Glenn Forsyth came by on a Friday evening, 2 beers in hand, and said what I had already been thinking. She's run this playbook before, Ray. 3 families gone in 2 years. Different complaints each time. Same structure. She files until people get exhausted and leave. He said it matter-of-factly, the way a retired sheriff's deputy says things, not alarmed, just accurate. I took the beer. I didn't say much, but I noted something Glenn didn't say, and probably didn't need to. She had run this playbook before because it had worked before. It had worked because every previous target had responded the way she expected. I had no intention of doing that. Have you ever watched someone run a strategy they've used successfully enough times that they've stopped checking whether it still applies? The 4th complaint was different. Not in its legal weight, it had none, like the others, but in its target. This one wasn't about setback distances or fire codes or noise levels. It was filed with the county assessor's office and questioned whether the studio conversion had been properly declared as an improvement to the property, suggesting potential tax fraud in the original permit application. Tax fraud. Against a retired civil engineer who had filed every document in triplicate and kept copies indexed by date. I sat with that one for a long time. Not because it frightened me, because it told me something important about where Margaret was willing to go. The first 3 complaints were harassment dressed as procedure. This one was an attempt to attach a criminal implication to my name in a public record. That is a different category of action entirely. That is someone who has decided the goal is not to win an argument, but to make the other person's life expensive enough, complicated enough, reputationally uncertain enough that leaving becomes the rational choice. Glenn had been right. This was a playbook, and I was now 4 moves into it. I called Corinne Lyle that evening, not to file anything, not to send a letter. I called her because I needed a second trained eye on the folder I had been building, and because I wanted her professional assessment of one specific question. Was there anything in what Margaret had done so far that we could not prove was coordinated and intentional if it came to that? Corinne went through the folder on a video call, page by page, taking her own notes. When she finished, she was quiet. For a moment, Ray, this is actually quite clean, she said. Every complaint dismissed, every dismissal documented. The timeline alone tells a story. If she keeps going, she's building your case for you. I asked her if we should send a cease and desist. She thought about it. We could. It would probably slow her down for a few weeks, but it would also tell her exactly where your line is, and she'd recalibrate and come back at a different angle. A pause, right now. She thinks she has you mapped. I'd rather let her keep thinking that. I told Corinne to keep the folder open and to start pulling whatever public records she could find on the HOA's financial history. Nothing aggressive, just a standard document review, the kind any homeowner had the right to request. Corinne said she'd start Monday. I thanked her, set the phone down, and looked out the kitchen window toward the studio. The light inside was off. The door was locked. Everything exactly as Linda had left it. I had not yet told Margaret Holloway a single thing she didn't already think she knew. I intended to keep it that way. Is there a difference between doing nothing and doing everything quietly? The next 3 weeks, I watched more than I moved. Margaret was on the HOA board every Tuesday evening. I started attending, not to speak. I hadn't spoken at a single meeting since moving to Cedarwood Commons, but to listen, to watch how she ran the room, who deferred to her and how quickly, who asked questions and how she handled the ones she didn't like, who stayed after the meeting ended, and who left without making eye contact with her. What I saw was a person who had confused familiarity with authority for so long that she no longer distinguished between the two. She ran every meeting from the same seat at the center of the table. She interrupted people mid-sentence without appearing to notice she was doing it. When a homeowner named Terrence Briggs raised a question about the fee structure for pool maintenance, Margaret answered before he finished the sentence, redirected to a different agenda item, and moved on before Terrence had time to reframe his question. He didn't try again. I wrote down T. Briggs, pool fee question, redirected without answer, did not follow up. I wrote down the names of the 2 board members who voted exactly as Margaret did on every motion without visible deliberation. I wrote down the name of the 1 board member, a younger woman named Diane Cho, who paused before each vote, looked at the agenda item, and occasionally asked for clarification before raising her hand. Diane Cho voted with Margaret every time, but she was the only one in the room who appeared to be actually thinking about it. I noted that too. Over those 3 weeks, I did not file a counter-complaint. I did not send a letter. I did not approach Margaret in the parking lot or at the mailboxes or anywhere else. She saw me at 2 meetings, and each time her expression carried the same faint satisfaction, the look of someone watching a problem resolve itself. She thought my attendance was observation without purpose. She was half right. While Margaret was filing complaints, I was doing something she would not have thought to look for. I was reading land records. It started as a habit from my working years. Whenever a project hit an unexpected obstacle, the first thing I did was go back to the original documentation. Not the current filing, not the recent survey, but the foundational record, the deed, the original plat, the zoning classification at the time the land was first subdivided. Most people never look that far back, because most of the time it doesn't matter. This time it did. Cedarwood Commons sat on land that had been zoned agricultural in 1957. Standard classification for undeveloped county acreage at that period. When the subdivision was platted in 1989, the developer had filed for residential reclassification with the city. But the county records, which operated on a separate system, had never been formally updated to reflect it. The city and the county had been using different classifications for the same land for 35 years, and because neither system flagged the discrepancy automatically, nobody had noticed. I noticed. I spent 4 evenings at the county clerk's office, working through the original agricultural zoning statutes with the kind of focused attention that comes from decades of reading technical documentation for a living. What I found was specific, and it was significant. Under the original 1957 agricultural classification, which remained the controlling classification in county records, certain land uses were permissible that fell entirely outside HOA covenant jurisdiction. Underground agricultural storage, private emergency shelters, residential workshop spaces used for non-commercial craft or trade purposes. The HOA covenants governed surface structures. They said nothing about what was below grade. I did not call Corinne that night. I sat with the documents for 2 full days, reading them from every angle, checking my interpretation against the statute language 3 separate times. This was not the kind of thing I wanted to be approximately right about. I needed to be exactly right. On the 3rd day, I called Corinne and walked her through everything I had found page by page. She was quiet for longer than usual when I finished. "Ray," she said finally, "do you understand what this means?" I told her I did. "How long have you been sitting on this?" 2 days. I told her. I wanted to be sure before I said it out loud. Another pause then, "Okay, don't do anything yet. Let me verify the chain independently." I told her to take whatever time she needed. I already had a contractor's name in my notebook. While Corinne was verifying, Margaret escalated. The 5th complaint came through the HOA board directly, a formal motion to place the studio on the non-compliance register, which would trigger a daily fine structure starting at $40 and doubling every 15 days until the structure was either modified to meet a new set of aesthetic guidelines or removed entirely. The motion passed 4-1 at the Tuesday meeting. Diane Cho was the one dissenting vote. She asked twice for the specific bylaw citation authorizing the fine structure. Margaret cited Section 7.4 of the HOA covenants without reading the actual language aloud. I looked up Section 7. For that night, it governed fence height and exterior paint colors. The fine notice arrived by certified mail 2 days later. $40 per day effective immediately with a compounding schedule attached. At the projected rate, I would owe over $3,000 within 60 days and more than $12,000 within 90. I signed for the envelope, set it in the folder, and called Corinne. She told me the fine structure had no legal basis under the covenants as written, and that we could challenge it and almost certainly win, but that a challenge would signal our hand and give Margaret time to restructure her approach before we were ready to move. How much time do you need? I asked. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. I did the math. 3 weeks at $40 a day was $840. If the doubling schedule kicked in, it climbed fast after that. Keep going, I said. Corinne paused. You're going to let the fines run. I told her I was going to let the fines run. What I didn't need to say to Corinne, who by then understood how I operated, was that every fine Margaret issued under an unauthorized fine structure was not a penalty. It was a liability. Every dollar she collected without legal standing was a dollar that would need to be returned with interest once the authority behind it was examined. She wasn't fining me. She was building my restitution case for me. It was at the 6th board meeting that Margaret said the thing she should not have said. I had been attending for 5 weeks by then. Same seat, 3rd row left side. I brought a notepad. I did not speak. I had not spoken at a single meeting since the complaints began, and Margaret had clearly decided my presence meant nothing. A stubborn old man sitting in the back, too proud to leave but too defeated to push back. That night she was discussing a proposed landscaping ordinance, new rules about allowable tree species along the street-facing property line. Standard HOA agenda filler. But near the end of the item, when a homeowner named Paul Veach asked whether existing approved structures would be grandfathered under the new ordinance, Margaret's answer took a turn. Generally, yes, she said, though of course the board retains discretion to revisit any prior approval that no longer serves the community's interests. She paused just long enough for the next part to land clearly. Some residents seem to believe that a piece of paper from 2 years ago is a permanent shield against community standards. It isn't. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew who she meant. A few heads turned briefly in my direction. I was writing in my notepad. I didn't look up. What Margaret had just done in front of 14 homeowners and 1 board member who asked questions before voting was announced publicly that she intended to challenge properly documented, fully approved, legally permitted structures based on her own discretionary interpretation of community standards. She had said it clearly on a Tuesday evening in a room where at least 3 people had their phones on the table. I wrote down the exact words. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the names of every person I could confirm was present. After the meeting, Glenn caught up with me in the parking lot. You hear what she just said? I told him I heard it. You going to do something about it? I clicked my pen closed and put the notepad in my jacket pocket. Not tonight, I said. Glenn looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of a man who spent 30 years reading situations for a living. Then he nodded slowly, like something had just confirmed itself. He didn't ask again. How dangerous is a person who has confused the absence of resistance with the absence of capability? Corinne called on a Thursday morning, 10 days after I told her to keep verifying. She had confirmed the zoning discrepancy independently through 2 separate county databases and cross-referenced it against the original 1,989 subdivision filing. The agricultural classification was unambiguous in county records. The residential reclassification existed only in city records. Neither system had ever been reconciled legally. The county classification was the controlling document for land use purposes outside city annex jurisdiction. And Cedarwood Commons, despite its city mailing address, sat in an unincorporated pocket that fell outside the annexation boundary by approximately 340 FT. 340 FT. 35 years of nobody checking. It's solid. Karen said. I had two colleagues review it independently. Both confirmed. You have standing to file under agricultural zoning statutes, and the HOA covenants have no jurisdiction over below-grade structures on agriculturally zoned land. I asked her how many permits we could file. She walked me through it. Agricultural storage, permissible under the original statute, for structures used to house equipment, tools, or materials related to residential land use. Emergency shelter, permissible under county emergency preparedness codes that predated the subdivision entirely. Utility expansion, permissible under a 1971 amendment to the agricultural zoning statute, covering private water and power infrastructure. Residential workshop, permissible under the same craft and trade provisions I had found in my initial reading. 4 permits, 4 separate municipal departments, each one routine enough to process without drawing attention from any single reviewing office. Each one a standalone application with its own justification and its own paper trail. And collectively, once approved, the legal foundation for a 2,200-square-foot underground workshop built directly beneath my backyard, below the surface where HOA covenants had any authority, below the grade where Margaret Holloway's discretionary interpretations of community standards could reach. I told Karen to prepare the filings. Then I called the contractor, a man named David Reyes, who had done underground utility work across the county for 22 years, and whose crew I had worked alongside on a drainage project in 2009. I trusted his precision, and I trusted his discretion. I told him what I was planning. I told him the permits were in process. I told him I needed an excavation crew available on short notice, ready to move within 48 hours of a date I would confirm. He asked me when I was thinking. I told him I was waiting for a specific window. He asked what kind of window. I told him the kind that opens when the person who's been watching your front door gets on a plane. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd have his crew ready. Meanwhile, Karen had pulled something else during her document review. Something I had not specifically asked for, but that she flagged because it appeared in the HOA's public financial filings. A recurring administrative services contract, renewed annually, paid from HOA dues collected from every homeowner in Cedarwood Commons. The contracted service provider was a property management company. The registered owner of that property management company was Margaret Holloway. Karen read me the amounts. $41,000 over 5 years routed from community funds to a company Margaret owned, approved each year by a board she controlled, disclosed nowhere in the annual meeting minutes distributed to homeowners. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I asked Karen how quickly she could document the full chain. Already started, she said. Diane Cho knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days after the board meeting where Margaret had made her public remark about prior approvals. She was carrying a folder of her own. I invited her in. She sat at the kitchen table, set the folder down, and looked at it for a moment before she spoke. I want to be careful about what I say. She started. I'm still on the board. I'm not here in any official capacity. I told her I understood. I've been on the board 14 months, she said. When I joined, I thought I was joining a neighborhood governance committee. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about what that's supposed to mean legally, and I've been doing a lot of comparing against what I've actually been participating in. She opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of board meeting minutes going back 3 years, with certain passages highlighted in yellow. Vote tallies, motion language, the recurring administrative services line item in the annual budget, approved each year without a disclosed conflict of interest statement from the board member who stood to benefit from it. She had found the same thread Karen had found working from a completely different direction. I don't know what you're planning, Diane said, clears throat, and I'm not asking, but I want you to know that if there's ever a point where someone who was present at these meetings needs to confirm what happened in that room, I have 14 months of notes. She slid the folder across the table toward me. I looked at it. I didn't pick it up yet. Why are you bringing this to me? I asked. She thought about that for a moment. Because you've been sitting in the back of those meetings for 5 weeks, and you haven't said a single word, and that either means you have nothing, or it means you're the only person in that room who actually knows what they're doing. She paused, and you don't strike me as someone who has nothing. I picked up the folder. I told her I would keep her name out of anything that didn't require it, and that if it came to a point where her confirmation mattered, I would give her as much notice as I could. She nodded, stood, and left without asking me anything else. Some people recognize patience without needing it explained to them. The 4 permits cleared on a Wednesday, not together. That would have drawn attention. Agricultural storage came through the county land use office on a Monday morning. Emergency shelter cleared the following day through the county emergency preparedness division. Utility expansion took an extra 48 hours because one reviewing clerk wanted a revised drainage impact statement, which David Reyes' engineer turned around in 6 hours. Residential workshop was the last. Approved Wednesday afternoon at 4:17 p.m. I had the confirmation emails printed and added to the folder before 5:00. Karen called that evening. Her voice had the particular quality it got when something had aligned precisely the way she had calculated it would. All 4 are clean, she said. Separate departments, separate reviewers, no cross-referencing flags. Each one stands independently. Collectively, they authorize the full scope of what you described to me. I asked about the HOA's ability to challenge. They can file an objection with the county, Karen said, but the objection would require them to argue against their own governing zoning classification, which they've never formally contested in 35 years. Any challenge they file becomes a public record that opens the entire zoning history to review. If they go that route, they're inviting exactly the scrutiny they don't want. She paused. Margaret would have to understand that to make that call, which means she'd have to know what she's actually looking at. I told Karen that Margaret didn't know what she was looking at yet. How long until she does? That depended on one thing. I had been watching Margaret's calendar the way I had watched everything else. From a distance, systematically, without drawing attention. She was a real estate broker. Her schedule was partially public through her agency's booking system. 3 weeks earlier, I had noted a conference registration in Scottsdale, a regional real estate summit running Thursday through Sunday of the coming week. I had confirmed her flight through a travel notice she had posted in the Cedarwood Commons neighborhood group, the kind of casual announcement people make when they want their neighbors to know they're leaving town. She was departing Thursday at 7:40 a.m. David Reyes had his crew on standby. The fines were now at $1,960 and climbing. The demolition order was still active. The noncompliance register notation was still on file. Everything Margaret had built against me over 4 months remained formally, in place uncontested, sitting in county and HOA records like a wall she believed I had no way through. She would be 30,000 FT over New Mexico when the concrete trucks turned onto Cedarwood Drive. What does it feel like to wait for a clock you set yourself, knowing the other person has no idea it's running? The night before Margaret's flight, Karen sent me a document package by encrypted email, 41 pages. She had spent 3 weeks pulling public financial records, HOA annual budgets, board meeting minutes, payment authorizations, vendor contracts, state business registration filings, and bank routing disclosures required under Texas nonprofit governance statutes. What she had assembled was not a theory. It was documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced financial record of exactly how Margaret Holloway had structured a cash operation inside a homeowners association she controlled. The administrative services contract was the spine of it, renewed every year for 5 consecutive years, approved each time by a board vote in which Margaret participated without disclosing her ownership stake in the contracting company. Under Texas law, that was a self-dealing violation. A board member voting to approve payments to they owned without disclosure to the membership was not a procedural irregularity. It was a breach of fiduciary duty, actionable under both civil and criminal statutes, depending on the amounts involved. The amounts involved were $41,000, but Karen had found something beyond the financial structure that reframed everything else. She had pulled the election records going back 5 years, the actual participation logs, the ballots cast, the quorum certifications Margaret had signed as presiding officer for each annual election. Texas HOA statute required 55% homeowner participation for a valid board election. The threshold was not a recommendation. It was a legal requirement for the election results to carry binding authority. Margaret's first election had returned 31% participation, her second 28%. By her fifth consecutive term, participation had dropped to 21%. She had certified all 5 elections as valid. She had signed the quorum confirmations herself. She had served 5 years as HOA president on the basis of elections that did not meet the legal threshold for legitimacy under the statute governing her own association. Every fine she had ever issued had no legal standing. Every rule she had ever enforced carried no binding authority. Every complaint she had filed in her capacity as HOA president had been filed by someone who did not legally hold that office, including the demolition order on Linda's studio, including the non-compliance register notation, including the $1,960 in fines currently accruing against my account. I read the 41 pages twice. Then I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the folder I had been building since the morning Margaret taped that first notice to the studio door. 4 months, 6 dismissed complaints, $2,000 in fines paid under protest, 14 board meetings attended in silence, 35 years of land records read, 4 permits filed through 4 separate departments, 1 contractor on standby, 1 attorney who had just handed me the most complete evidentiary package I had ever seen assembled outside of formal legal proceeding. I thought about the 3 families Glenn had mentioned, the ones who had left, the ones who had gotten exhausted and decided it wasn't worth it. I thought about what Margaret had never understood about that word worth. I closed the folder. I set my alarm for 5:45 a.m. David Reyes's crew was arriving at 6:00. The second board meeting of that month fell on the Tuesday before Margaret's flight. I didn't know she had moved it forward by a week until I arrived and found the room already half full with an energy I hadn't seen at any previous meeting. Margaret was standing at the front rather than seated at the table. That was new. She had printed materials stacked beside her, multiple copies of something face down. I took my seat in the 3rd row. I opened my notepad. She called the meeting to order 4 minutes early and moved immediately to a single agenda item she had titled in the printed materials she distributed, Resolution 2024-11, Enforcement of Structural Noncompliance and Formal Abatement Authorization. I read it while she spoke. It was a board resolution authorizing the HOA to engage a licensed contractor to physically remove a noncompliant structure at 14 Cedarwood Drive, my address, at the homeowner's expense, with costs added to the property's HOA lien account if unpaid within 30 days. It cited the original demolition notice. It cited the noncompliance register notation. It cited Section 7.4, the fence and paint color bylaw, as the governing authority. Margaret presented it to the room with the calm efficiency of someone closing a transaction. "This has been a prolonged process," she said. "The board has been patient. The homeowner has had ample opportunity to bring the property into compliance voluntarily. At this point, the board has both the authority and the obligation to act." Diane Cho asked for the specific statutory authorization for physical abatement by the HOA. Margaret cited the same Section 7.4. Diane asked if Section 7.4 actually authorized physical removal of structures or only aesthetic modifications. Margaret said the board's legal interpretation was that the language was sufficiently broad. Diane asked if that interpretation had been reviewed by an independent attorney. Margaret said the board was satisfied with its own review. The vote was called. 4 in favor. Diane abstained, the first time in 14 months she had not voted with the board either way. The resolution passed. Margaret looked up from the table, and for the first time that evening looked directly at me. Her expression was not triumphant exactly. It was more settled than that. The expression of someone who has finished a task they considered long overdue. "The abatement contractor will be scheduled within 10 business days," she said. "Mr. Callahan, you'll receive formal written notice by certified mail." I wrote down the time. I wrote down the vote count. I wrote down Diane's abstention. Then I closed my notepad, stood, and walked out of the room without speaking. In the parking lot, the night air was cold enough to see my breath. I sat in my truck for a few minutes with the engine off. The resolution meant that within 10 business days, someone Margaret hired could show up at my property with authorization, however legally hollow, to demolish the studio. Linda's wheel, her glazing tools, the shelves of unfinished bowls with the masking tape, labels in her handwriting. For the Garza kids, finish with iron oxide wash. Don't rush the drying. I sat with that for a long time. Then I started the engine and drove home. Margaret's flight was in 36 hours. David Ray's crew was arriving in 43. I was going to be cutting it close, but I was going to be cutting it correctly. How much does it cost to hold your position when everything in you wants to move? And how much more does it cost if you move too soon? I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety. I had made my decisions. The permits were clean. Corinne's package was complete. David's crew was confirmed. The practical side of things was as prepared as it was going to be. What kept me awake was something quieter than strategy. I went out to the studio around midnight. I unlocked the door and stood inside without turning on the overhead light. Just the small lamp on the workbench that Linda had used when she worked late. It threw a warm, narrow light across the wheel and left the rest of the room in soft shadow. I stood there for a while, not doing anything particular, just being in the space. Her glazing tools hung on the pegboard exactly as she had arranged them, smallest to largest, left to right. I had dusted them twice in the months since the complaints began, not because they needed it, but because it was the only form of maintenance the space seemed to require. And because doing it made me feel, briefly, that I was still taking care of something she had cared about. The unfinished bowls on the back shelves caught the edge of the lamp light. The masking tape labels in her handwriting. For the Garza kids. I didn't know the Garza kids. I didn't know if they still lived nearby, or if they had ever come to a class, or if Linda had ever finished telling them whatever she had planned to show them with that bowl. I only knew she had labeled it, which meant she had intended to come back to it. She had always intended to come back to things. I thought about what the last 4 months had actually cost. Not the fines, those were recoverable. Not the time, that had been spent, not wasted. The real cost was this, 37 nights of going to bed knowing that someone was actively trying to take the last room that still held the shape of Linda's life and not yet being in a position to stop it cleanly. That kind of waiting leaves a mark, even when you've chosen it deliberately, even when you know it's right. Linda used to say that the hardest part of working with clay wasn't the shaping. It was the waiting between stages, the drying, the cooling, the curing, when the piece was most vulnerable, and there was nothing to do but leave it alone and trust the process. I turned off the lamp and locked the studio door. 31 hours until David's crew arrived. I went back inside and made coffee. Margaret's flight departed at 7:40 a.m. Thursday. Clear as throat, David Ray's first truck turned onto Cedarwood Drive at 6:02 a.m. I had the 4 permit approvals, posted on the backyard fence before the second truck arrived, laminated in clear protective sleeves, each one facing outward at eye level. Agricultural storage, emergency shelter, utility expansion, residential workshop. The way you post permits on a job site when you want anyone who looks to see exactly what authority you're operating under. By 7:00, there were 3 trucks, a compactor, and 11 workers in my backyard. The excavation was clean and systematic, the way work looks when the people doing it have done it many times before. David ran his crew quietly. No unnecessary noise, no theatrical production, just equipment moving earth at a professional pace, on a properly permitted site on a Thursday morning in a residential neighborhood. Glenn came out of his house across the street at 7:15, coffee in hand, and stood on his front porch watching for a long moment. Then he walked over. He looked at the permits on the fence. He looked at the crew. He looked at me. Underground, he said. 2,200 square feet, I said. 68 degrees year-round, full ventilation, enough lighting to work by for hours. He was quiet for a moment. Below HOA jurisdiction, he said. Below HOA jurisdiction. I confirmed. He nodded slowly and drank his coffee and didn't say anything else for a while. We stood together watching the work proceed. Corinne sent the certified letter to Margaret's home address Thursday afternoon. Time to arrive during the Saturday delivery window. 2 days into the Scottsdale conference, far enough into the trip that Margaret would have fully settled into the rhythm of being away, close enough to her return that she would have no time to organize a response before coming home. The letter was 41 pages, plus a 3-page cover summary. It documented the 5 consecutive invalid elections, each one certified by Margaret, with a participation rate below the legally required 55% threshold. It documented the self-dealing contract, 5 years of administrative services payments routed to a company Margaret owned, approved by a board she controlled, disclosed to no one. It itemized the $41,000. It cited these specific Texas statutes governing HOA election validity, board member fiduciary duty, and financial self-dealing. It noted that copies had been filed with the county attorney's office and the Texas Real Estate Commission, which governed Margaret's broker's license as of Thursday morning. It also noted in the final paragraph of the cover summary that every enforcement action taken during Margaret's legally invalid presidency, including the demolition order, the noncompliance register notation, and the $1,960 in fines assessed against the property at 14 Cedarwood Drive, carried no legal authority and was hereby formally contested as void. Corinne had also, at my request, drafted and sent a separate notice to every homeowner in Cedarwood Commons, not inflammatory, not accusatory in tone, a factual summary of the election participation records, the financial disclosures, and the county filing, with a note that a legitimate HOA election, conducted under proper statutory requirements, would need to be organized within 90 days to restore valid governance to the association. By Friday evening, my phone had 11 messages from neighbors I had never spoken to. Margaret came home Sunday afternoon. I know because Glenn texted me at 2:17 p.m. White Range Rover just pulled in. By then, the concrete access hatch was set clean in my backyard. The construction permit still posted on the fence, the site closed and graded and indistinguishable from finished work, because it was finished work. David's crew had completed the shell structure in 3 days. The interior fit-out would take longer, but the legal foundation, the physical fact of the below-grade structure, permitted and built and existing, was already permanent. She came to my door Monday morning. I heard the knock and took a moment before I answered it. Not for effect, because I wanted to be settled when I opened the door. The way you want to be settled at the beginning of a conversation you've been moving toward for 4 months. She looked smaller than she had at the mailboxes the day this started. The Range Rover confidence was completely gone. What replaced it was something I recognized from my working years. The specific expression of a person who has just finished reading a document that reordered everything they thought they controlled. Ray, she said, can we just talk about this? I looked at her for a moment. Corinne already filed, I said. That part's not mine to undo. She started to say something else. I could see her working through possible framings, negotiation, explanation, appeal to neighborly goodwill, some version of let's handle this between ourselves. Every opening she found led back to the same closed door. I think there may have been some misunderstandings along the way. She said finally, I thought about the demolition order taped to the studio door at 7:00 in the morning. The tax fraud implication filed in public records, the board resolution authorizing physical removal of the last space that held Linda's unfinished work, passed 4-1 on a Tuesday evening while I sat in the 3rd row and wrote down the time. I don't think there were, I said. I wasn't cold about it. I wasn't angry. I said it the way you state a measurement accurately, without inflection, because the number is what it is. She left without another word. Standing in the doorway, I looked across the yard at the concrete access hatch sitting cleanly in the backyard. The permit sleeves still on the fence catching the morning light. I thought about the spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer 3/4 full. I thought about Deanne Cho's folder on my table. I thought about 11 messages from neighbors I'd never met. I had not stopped Margaret by confronting her. I had stopped her by building something so far beneath the surface that by the time she realized what had happened, it was already permanent. And by letting her spend 4 months constructing the exact evidence needed to dismantle everything she thought she owned. She had come to tear down a shed. She had not known the real work was already underground. When someone finally understands, they were never in control of the situation. What's the exact moment they realize it wasn't your silence that defeated them, but their own confidence in reading it wrong? The county investigation ran 6 weeks. Margaret resigned from the HOA board before the findings were published. A Friday afternoon resignation letter, submitted by email citing personal and professional commitments. No acknowledgement of the investigation. No acknowledgement of the election records or the financial disclosures. The kind of exit that tries to look like a choice when it isn't. The findings were published regardless. The county attorney's report confirmed 5 consecutive invalid elections, documented the self-dealing contract in full, and ordered complete financial restitution to the Cedarwood Commons HOA for the $41,000 in misappropriated administrative fees with interest. The Texas Real Estate Commission opened a separate review of Margaret's broker's license based on the fiduciary breach. Findings: that process was still ongoing when Cedarwood Commons held its first legitimate board election in 6 years, conducted with proper notice, proper participation monitoring, and an independent observer from the county clerk's office. Turnout was 71%. Diane Cho was elected president by a margin that wasn't close. The new board's first formal action was to void all enforcement actions taken during the invalid presidency period. Every fine, every non-compliance notation, every demolition order, the $1,960 assessed against my property, was returned within 30 days, along with a written confirmation that the studio at 14 Cedarwood Drive had been and remained in full compliance with all applicable standards. I framed that letter not prominently, just on the wall inside the studio near the door where I would see it when I came in. The underground workshop hosted its first Saturday session 3 months after the access hatch was set. 8 neighborhood kids ages 9 to 14 referred through the Community Arts Center, where Linda had taught for 30 years. I had reached out to the center's director in the weeks after the investigation closed, explained what I was building, explained what it had been built to hold. She had cried a little on the phone. She said Linda had talked about wanting a dedicated space for years. That first morning, I carried Linda's wheel down through the access hatch myself. I had restored it over the preceding weeks, cleaned the bearings, replaced the drive belt, calibrated the speed control. It ran as smoothly as it had when Linda used it. I positioned it the way she always positioned her wheel, angled slightly toward the light source, enough room on the left side for a student to stand and watch before trying. Glenn came by mid-morning, coffee in hand, and looked down through the hatch at 8 kids gathered around a pottery wheel in a room that ran 68 degrees and smelled like clay and new concrete. "You know what she never understood," he said. "She thought the shed was the target." I looked up at him from the bottom of the stairs. "She was always looking at the wrong thing," I said. Glenn nodded, drank his coffee, looked at the kids below us. A 9-year-old girl was centering her first piece of clay on Linda's wheel, hands steady, listening to the rhythm of the rotation, learning that the work requires patience before it requires anything else. What would you be willing to endure, and for how long, to protect something that matters more than your comfort, your pride, or your need to be seen winning? Here's what this story was really about: not a shed, not a zoning dispute, not even an HOA. It was about what happens when someone with unchecked authority has gone so long without consequences that they've forgotten consequences exist. Margaret Holloway wasn't a villain in the cartoon sense. She was something more ordinary and more dangerous. A person who had learned that most people will exhaust themselves emotionally before they exhaust their options legally. And she had built an entire system around that assumption. She was right about most people. She was wrong about Ray. Here's exactly where she lost. Not at the board meeting. Not when Karen sent the letter. She lost the moment she taped that demolition notice to the studio door and walked back to her car without looking at the house. That was the moment she decided. She already knew what kind of man was watching her from that window. She had profiled him. Quiet, grieving, older, unlikely to fight. And she committed to that profile completely. She stopped observing. She stopped asking whether her read was accurate. And a person who stops asking that question will keep walking forward with total confidence, straight into something they never saw being built. That's not bad luck. That's the inevitable result of confusing the absence of resistance with the absence of capability. And Ray won for one reason above all others. Not because he was smarter, though he was. Not because he had better lawyers, though he did. He won because he understood something most people never learn. That the desire to be seen winning is the thing that most often prevents you from actually winning. Every instinct in a situation like that screams at you to respond, to correct the record, to make sure everyone in the room knows you're not defeated. Ray felt that instinct. He was honest about it. And he chose. Deliberately, to let it pass. He documented instead of reacted. He built instead of argued. He waited for the moment that couldn't be walked back, and he let her spend 4 months building it for him. The studio was never really at risk. Not once he decided it wasn't going to be. Most people have met some version of Margaret Holloway. Maybe not in an HOA. Maybe in a workplace, a landlord, a family member with a little institutional power, and a long habit of not being questioned. Someone who files the complaint, sends the letter, calls the meeting, and has learned that the sheer weight of bureaucratic pressure will make most people fold before they ever think to look at the foundation the pressure is coming from. And in question that story leaves me with, the one I keep coming back to, is a simple one. The morning she posted that notice and walked back to her car, Ray chose to say nothing. He chose to write down the time and wait. I want to know what you would have done. At what point in that 4-month process would you have stopped documenting and decided it was time to fight back? Leave it in the comments. I read them, and I mean that. Stories like this one exist because people recognize something true in them, and I want to know what that is for you. If you stay for stories where quiet preparation beats loud authority, there are more coming. I'll see you in the next one.